Just been talking about Henry Ford and the assembly line and the $5 day, the fact that he paid his workers so well. So these were the results of the assembly line. Mass production is possible, so cars can be sold more cheaply. Labor has become de-skilled, so the individual is a lot more expendable, which leads us to that film clip that we watched previously from the Charlie Chaplin movie, Modern Times, in which Chaplin is caught up like a cog in the machine. That a lot of people were feeling in the 19-teens, 1920s, and 30s that that's what was happening to them, that's what was happening to workers. The Ford Motor Company had a division called the Social Department. At least in the 19-teens, for a few years, it had this division. The $5 day doubled wages from what most people made in that industry were made available, but it wasn't automatic. You had to qualify as a worker to receive that $5 a day, and you qualified by being approved by the social department. Inspectors from this division would watch you as you worked, sometimes come and pay surprise visits to your house. They're watching you to see if you're behaving in a moral way as defined by Mr. Ford. If you were not, you don't get the extra money. No smoking, no gambling, no swearing, various other things. Totally banned at work, discouraged at home. They didn't have the right to ban any kind of behavior in their workers' home, but if they made these surprise inspections and you were doing some of these things, well, it might not be banned, but you can probably guess what would happen to your prospects of making your full wages. Workers were not too keen on this, not surprisingly. It's kind of creepy. It's kind of weird. It's kind of very, very controlling. Also creepy and weird, at least to modern eyes, not so much probably at the time, was Henry Ford's very, very open and blatant anti-Semitism. He had this little the Ford International Weekly, sort of company newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, in which they ran opinion pieces, and sometimes Ford wrote opinion pieces about the dangers to the world posed by the Jews. Here you can see some of the headlines. You may not be able to make them out real well. The International Jew, the World's Problem. Jewish jazz or moron music becomes our national music. And then here's a quote from him in 1920 after the Black Sox scandal that we'll talk about later. Henry Ford said, "If fans wish to know the trouble with American baseball, they have it in 3 words, too much Jew." Now, as I said, this was not as problematic in 1920 for someone issuing statements like this as it is now, because there was a lot of anti-Semitism in this country. It was more the norm than the exception. However, as the years went by, particularly as Hitler rose to power, and then especially when World War II was going on full swing, and it became known to the world public what Hitler was doing to Jews, then this type of thing started to be very frowned on indeed. But the time period that we're talking about, it was fairly normal. And Henry Ford did not hold back from such announcements. He was joined by celebrities of the day, in his opinions, people from Charles Lindbergh, the famous hero pilot, to Walt Disney. Despite the fact that Ford paid such good wages, he was definitely not in favor of unions. not in favor of unions in any way, shape, or form. In addition to that social department, there was also something called, euphemistically, the service department, that really was security, and it was headed up by a guy named Harry Bennett, a former Navy boxer and really something of a thug. He and his service department personnel would show up at meetings aimed at organizing unions and at demonstrations, and basically just beat the crap out of people. March 1932, there was a march of workers called the Ford Hunger March, in which Bennett and his people showed up and started attacking people. 5 people were killed, dozens were injured. But probably the most obvious abuse of power, really, with Bennett representing Ford and his efforts to quash any efforts at unionization, happened in Detroit in 1937. What is known as the Battle of the Overpass. There was a large protest being staged, a protest against Ford's policies where workers were concerned. And several labor organizers were standing on an overpass talking to reporters. There were also photographers present when Bennett and his men showed up with sticks and just beat the crap out of everybody. Here you can actually see news photographers capturing what was going on and the aftermath. On the one hand, this doesn't seem like a very wise strategy on the part of Bennett and Ford, right? Because the public was not too keen on this type of behavior. On the other hand, it probably was true that they just didn't care that there were reporters. They didn't care who saw. In fact, maybe they wanted people to see so that potential labor organizers could see what fate might await them. In 1937, Upton Sinclair, famous muckraker author of The Jungle, about meat packing, and various other books, wrote a novel called The Flivver King that was a fictionalized account of the rise and fall of Henry Ford. It intertwined the stories of Ford and a fictional character named Abner Shutt and his family, who worked for Ford down through the decades. And it showed how Ford became more and more controlling and more, anti-union. The book was distributed widely by the United Auto Workers Union. For many years, when you joined the union, for I think it was a quarter, you could get a copy of this novel. Other books by Sinclair, who was active until the 1960s, included King Cole, you can guess what that one was about, and a novel called Oil that was filmed a few years ago under the title There Will Be Blood. Henry Ford was so opposed to unions that when it looked like it was inevitable that a union was going to be formed in his company, he was ready to just dismantle the company rather than give in. His wife ultimately helped talk him out of that because it was going to be taking the money from the company away from his family. But he was ready to do it. He was ready to just toss the whole thing like he had done once before and start over from scratch. All right, now we will go back in time again. Actually, with Henry Ford, we've jumped around quite a bit in time following his career trajectory. But now, finally, we are about to enter the Great War, the war to end all wars, World War I.